Welcome, everybody. I am glad to introduce you my dear friend Peter Forrest, who's going to lecture, and he's going to give the first Physis lectures on analytic metaphysics, devoted to a very important topic, which is combinatorial possibility. We are also commemorating part of the work of his former professor, David Armstrong, who devoted spent a lot of time dealing with questions about modal metaphysics. So these lectures in analytic metaphysics are divided into 4 lectures. First lecture is today, the 1st of July, and the lectures are on combinatorial possibility, and the first lecture is entitled The Conceivable and the Possible.
And thank you for coming. I don't know whether you like the heat or not, but if you don't, and I am married to a woman who doesn't, I understand these things, it's especially good for you to come in this hotter than usual weather. I know it's always hot in summer in Madrid, but hotter than usual weather, rather than retreating to some cool and shady spot. Okay, I'll just begin. I mean, as I said, thank you very much. Put some rather grim pictures here of the great man after whom this place is named, this woman. Okay, as I wrote these, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to read this because even if I spoke Spanish, your English would be far better than my Spanish, but I don't. Even so, if it's in a foreign language, it's sometimes easier to read along. So I'll just read it out. I won't read everything because we wouldn't have time. Roughly speaking, you'll find that I don't read what's in the brackets if you're reading along with me. Anyway, as I began writing these lectures on the combinatorial theory of possibility, I realized I had to say something about universals. And I realized that there's a strong case for universals from the nature of possibility. And although he wasn't right about everything in analytic ontology, my former teacher, David Armstrong, was right about many more things than I thought he was when he taught me. When he taught me, I was always trying to point out the mistakes and the objections and so on. But perhaps because he's died, I don't know, or perhaps because I'm just getting old, I now think he was right about a lot of things. So we could call these lectures a critical appreciation of Armstrong's ontology. Now, we will be getting on to a combinatorial theory of possibility, but one of the things I'll do is I will criticize the combinatorial theory of complex universals, which I used to hold, and wrote some impenetrable papers. As impenetrable, I mean, if you're from this university, you obviously know this story, but if you're not, you may not. In the Spanish Civil War, they needed to protect themselves from bullets, so in the philosophy building, they chose the most impenetrable thing they could. You can guess what that was. Metaphysics books to protect them from the bullets. Now my papers on a combinatorial theory of universals is about as impenetrable as the books that were used in the Civil War to protect from bullets, I'm afraid. And so I've now given up on those. I don't recommend reading them unless you really want to show what difficulties you can get in if you pursue a research program. Lakatosh style, rather than just give up on it. Now, there's a lot to be said about the importance of analytic ontology, but I won't go into that here. I'm just taking it as given that we've made a case that it's worth doing. We're not just wasting our time. So here's the basic idea of a combinatorial theory of possibility. We all know they're blue birds. We all know they're brown gorillas. So it's possible we can combine gorilla with the color blue to make the possibility of blue gorillas. And that contains as parts, or at least as constituents in some part-like sense, the property of being blue and the kind gorilla. The idea is that the recombination of properties is an insight into the nature of possible situations, not just how we discover them. Now, David Armstrong, in his A Combinatorial Theory of Possibility, treated non-actual possibilities as fictions grounded in non-fictional, that's real, that's what I mean by real, non-fictional universals. So universals only pretend parts of the fiction. And basically that's what I'll be defending. I'll be defending it on the basis there's no other theory that works. There are some problems with the details which I'll come to. So this first lecture is somewhat of a preliminary in which I want to argue we really do need the concept of the metaphysically possible, distinct from the weaker concept of conceivability and the stronger concept of nomic or natural necessity. Later, I shall argue that universals ground all metaphysical necessity, and rather pompously, I call that the nexus between universals and possibilities. Metaphysically necessary truths are precisely those truths about universals that are not about their particular non-fictional instances. Okay, now, there's some preliminaries. There's a lot of history to this, which isn't particularly important to us, but I should say that I'm presenting a theory of concepts and propositions as well as mind-independent items. There's a lot of confusion if you think that concepts have to be conceived of. Clearly, there's a connection between concepts and our actually conceiving of something, and that's because concepts are the kind of thing that we conceive of when we think of something. Okay? So I am going to be assuming that concepts are mind-independent items and that there's far more that's conceivable than has actually been conceived of. And there's a final preliminary. I want to use the idea of a fiction. I am very queasy about fictions. Fictions, make me nervous. In metaphysics, of course. I'm considering coherent ones that are conceivably actual. So a careless author, or maybe an author might deliberately do this if the work is picaresque, but a careless author might assign age 30 to a character who a year later is now 33. That's an incoherent fiction. Now, I just want to make a small plea for fictionalism, even though I don't like it, I'm driven to it. And I want to say that fictionalism about numbers is, I think, the common sense position. If I say that the Indian thinker, Indian mathematician Brahmagupta discovered negative numbers, he used the example of debts being negative assets, which has a rather modern and familiar ring to it, back in the 8th century. He discovered negative numbers. A lot of people common sensically would say, he didn't really discover them, did he? He invented them. No, I say he discovered them because I'm a realist. I think it's one of the great discoveries. He might not have discovered zero, but maybe he did. Maybe someone did 100 years before. It's hard to tell. The Indians were much better mathematicians than historians. So we don't know. I assume truths about fiction are always grounded in truths about non-fiction. I mean, if that's... we can give examples. The one I've got down here is an ideal gas. Okay, you can do a lot of, physics. I don't know whether it's high school physics or elementary, first year university physics, but it's not particularly difficult physics. Playing around with the equation, pressure times volume equals a constant R times absolute temperature T. And you can do some calculus and so on. Now, there are no gases which that's true, but they're approximated. It's a fiction, but it's a fiction grounded in the way gases really are. Now, it's not easy to say exactly what a fiction is, but my idea is that whatever fictions are, truths about them don't just exist in a vacuum. An author can make certain things true in fiction, of course, but then a whole lot of other things become true too. And there's a project, it's not mine, by philosophers who have to teach a unit called aesthetics, and they don't have an aesthetic bone in their body. They think, now what on earth can I talk about? Well, they can talk about metaphor and fiction and give their students something to think about. Okay, so I'm going to talk about fictions, and but I don't like them. I don't know why I don't like them, but I don't like them. Now, metaphysical possibility is distinct, conceptually, I should say, from nomic possibility. Nomic necessity, that which is true because of the laws of nature. Now, why are the two different? You would simplify your metaphysics somewhat if you said the two were the same. And for those who are interested, as I am, in philosophy of religion, the identification of the two would have considerable consequences in that area. Now, why are the two different? Well, the general argument is it's conceivable that the paradigms of nomic necessity, which are presumably the unknown fundamental laws of nature, we don't have them yet, but I believe they're out there. Anyway, there may be fictions, it doesn't matter. Fictions can be quite good paradigms. Have an explanation that shows there might have been different laws. Now, I'm not saying I would say, but I'm not here saying that they actually do have some such explanation. I'm just saying it's conceivable. Now, there are three explanations out there in the philosophical marketplace. A creator might have chosen those laws because of their intrinsic and instrumental value. They're very beautiful to start off with. Or these laws might hold because of their intrinsic and instrumental value without even needing a creator. That's a sort of Platonist theory or Neoplatonist theory proposed recently by John Leslie and others. Or the universe might be composed of many disconnected components. The uppercase U universe might consist of many small u universes that are quite different, disconnected, and the laws might hold only in some of those. Even the fundamental laws might vary. Now, that's the argument that there's conceivably a difference, because those explanations make sense. We understand them as explanations, regardless of whether we agree with them. Now, they prompt the objection, of course, this is merely a conceptual distinction, and there's a difference between that and a genuine distinction. So it's compatible with the idea of metaphysical with nomic necessity by those who reject those explanations. I make 2 points in reply. The first is, although it's plausible that the quarks and leptons of the standard theory of physics couldn't exist without behaving much as they do, it's not quite as plausible they must behave exactly as they do. For instance, suppose the theory tells us that electrons never decay. Then is it really impossible for them to have a very small, even an infinitesimal chance of decaying? So in an individual universe, some electron might somewhere decay eventually. Would those, is that really a metaphysical impossibility? Putting that appeal to intuition to one side, let us grant, my opponent, that obeying the actual laws of nature is metaphysically necessary for the actual kinds of things. That, of course, does not settle whether there could not be other kinds obeying other laws. So even if electrons never decay, why might not it be possible for there to be, say, cell electrons, which are otherwise very similar but have a small chance of decaying? My other point is, well, I won't make the other point. So we've got the, I'm going to skip a bit. That's the argument that it's at least conceivable that we've got different concepts here. Okay, and I'm suggesting that now, of course, if you can now argue that if it's conceivable that what's metaphysically possible is distinct from what's nomically possible, then either we've got to distinguish conceivability from metaphysical possibility, or we've got to distinguish metaphysical possibility from nomic possibility. Because if we don't, then we say it's just possibly possible that they're distinct, so they're distinct if they're, sorry, it's just possible there, if they're conceivably distinct, so if conceivability is assimilated to possibility, it's possible they're distinct. But if you're not distinguishing metaphysical possibility from nomic possibility, then the fact that it's possible they're distinct means they are distinct, given some plausible principles of modality. And so what that shows is that at very least, you've got to make one of the two distinctions between conceivability, metaphysical possibility, and nomic possibility. Okay. Now, the idea that metaphysical possibility is at least prima facie distinct from conceivability. Okay. Now, David Chalmers distinguishes positive from negative conceivability and ideal from prima facie conceivability. I want to collapse that by stipulating that by conceivability I mean what he calls ideal positive conceivability. Chalmers uses the example of an as yet unproven mathematical theorem, say Goldbach's conjecture. It doesn't matter what the theorem is, there are lots of conjectures which are as yet unproven, and it's probable some of them will turn out to be true. Its negation is prima facie but not ideally conceivable. So the ideal conceivability is roughly to say it's true an ideal thinker could conceive of it. And again, it doesn't matter if the ideal thinker is just a fiction. So let's look at Kripke's examples or Kripkean examples, such as gold is the kind of stuff made of atoms with 79 protons, water is H2O, Hesperus is phosphorus. These are presented as necessary truths not knowable a priori. They may also be used to distinguish conceivability from metaphysical possibility. There are similar examples that can be reasoned to a priori. It doesn't require that they're a posteriori. The clearest examples are mathematical. There are two well-known sequences of transfinite cardinals, the Alephs and the Beths. The continuum hypothesis states that the transfinite cardinal Beth1 is the very same as Aleph1. The generalized continuum hypothesis asserts that all the Alephs just are the Beths. Now, these are good examples, though somewhat recherche. They're good examples because it's provable that both asserting and denying these is consistent with all the more elementary parts of mathematics. They make exactly the same point as Cicero's Tully, or gold is the kind of stuff made of atoms with 79 protons. The point is, although these are non-contingent, one's going to be true, it's either it or its negation is true, it's conceivable, whatever's true here is necessary, but it's conceivably false. And of course you might deny there are such things as mathematical truths, but again I would argue the mere conceivability of mathematical realisms establishes the conceptual distinction between the necessary and the conceivable. Okay, so I made some sort of case then for saying that we should distinguish conceivability from metaphysical possibility from gnomic possibility, and I think there's an even stronger case that we must make at least one of those two distinctions. A response last century, last millennium even, to this was that to use two-dimensional modal logic. Kripke's famous lectures were about naming, of course, as well as necessity. And some of his examples, like Phosphorus's Hesperus, are more interesting for philosophy of language than for metaphysics. And they're understood in terms of two-dimensional modal logic. The basic idea is quite straightforward. We take a referring expression, say Hesperus. We can ask what it refers to when we are in this world and are thinking about a counterfactual situation. Or we can imagine ourselves being put into the counterfactual situation and using the same word. A word here is itself, of course, a somewhat abstract item, because although Hesperus is the same word in written English and Spanish, the pronunciation is different. I mean, but it's the same word in this sense, even if it's in, but it's the same name. It even survives translations of names. So its word here is a slightly abstract thing. So we can ask what it is. If we were transported science fiction-wise to a different world, would how would that word then refer? So if it refers rigidly, we are referring to the same thing as it refers to in the actual world, which gives us, of course, the famous necessity of the identity Hesperus is phosphorus. But if we were transported to another world, science fiction style, with rather complicated arrangement of planets, the words Hesperus and phosphorus would refer to two different things. So if you take it in the non-rigid way, then it's not necessary. And then it simply becomes a matter of empirical linguistic theory, whether people actually do use such words in the rigid or the non-rigid sense. And no doubt it's correct that we use such words rigidly, and hence Hesperus is phosphorus is necessarily true. Now, that's interesting, because language is interesting, but it's not metaphysically important by itself. The point is that we can apply this same thing to reference to properties and kinds and relations, the sorts of things that may turn out to be universals. The same kind of mechanism as we use for referring to material objects can be used to refer to other things. Thus, assuming the term gold actually refers to the same kind as the phrase stuff made of atoms with 79 protons, 79 stuff, it's a necessary truth that gold is 79 stuff. But that's the claim I would want to make, and a lot of people would want to make. It's conceivable, however, that gold should have turned out to be a silver-copper alloy. That conceivability is explained by the way a flaccid, that is a non-rigid variant of the term gold, might well pick out a silver-copper alloy in some other possible world. If we were transported to another world where there was no, where the chemistry was slightly different, there was no 79 stuff because it decayed radioactively rather rapidly, but there was a certain amount of a silver-copper alloy that people prized highly and had many but not all the properties of gold. If we were transported to that and used the words psychologically, in terms of narrow psychology, if you like, the way we do in this world, then silver-copper alloy would turn out to be gold. Anything which presents as gold would turn out to be gold. Now, this is a straightforward explanation of metaphysical necessity. What we've got by combining what in the case of reference to objects is somewhat trivial, we just call this thing, even if this thing is in another world, is trivial, it's just identity. In the case of kinds and other candidates for universals, seems to be rather non-trivial. We find that of necessity, gold is 79 stuff because we are referring to that kind of stuff and then referring again to that kind of stuff. So identity gives us necessity. But it's not compatible. I mean, this is a simple explanation, and we should not lightly reject it. I mean, I don't like methodology, but I keep finding myself opining on it. And as a sort of methodological principle, if you have a simple, straightforward explanation for something, don't go looking for a complicated, abstruse one. So suppose we identified a kind with a class of actual things, then we wouldn't get the right sort of necessity. What we would find is that for all actual pieces of gold, necessarily this piece is 79 stuff, but we wouldn't get the necessity of the generalization that all pieces of gold are 79 stuff. And that shows that we can't identify a kind with an actual class of things. The same argument, I say, holds for the identification of properties with classes of property instances or so-called tropes. I hate the use of the word trope for this, but that's how it is. The so-called tropes. Because tropes are thought of as actual things, and a class of tropes is a class of actual things, you won't get the right necessity if you just try to identify gold tropes with 79 stuff tropes. Now, two-dimensional modal logic doesn't do all the work because we've got to be able to refer to universals. Moreover, because we're not restricting attention to the necessities we know of, we can't be considering referring expressions which human beings actually use, but like words generally and propositions and concepts, we've got to be thinking of some things of the kind, which some of them we use and others we don't use yet and may never use. And if we're just thinking of, and that gives us a shift from the language to the metaphysics, because when we're thinking about possible referring expressions, we need some sort of metaphysical account of them, some sort of ontological account of them, and what we in fact need are higher order properties. The identity of universals is then, strictly speaking, the fact that two distinct higher order properties share a single instance. And there's nothing perplexing about that. Things have many properties, so universals can have many higher order properties. And this provides a case then for treating kinds and attributes as universals. It's not the only case there is for it, and for holding there are higher order universals. I haven't yet excluded the idea that all universals are fictions, but somewhere in our theory we've got to ground the fictions in the non-fictions. My argument then is we must use universals to explain necessity. Once we've reached that conclusion, we can generalize, noting that not merely the existence of universals, but the non-existence of others, and relations between them are non-contingent. Okay, now I'm going to list some other necessities just to show that there's quite a list of them, and you might disagree with some of them. You might say they're not necessary. There's multiple realization, that's a big problem. it's a controversial topic in the metaphysics of mind, but a less controversial example might be the colours of light. The relation between the colours of light and the underlying distribution of frequencies. Now, we know there are many different distributions of frequencies that necessitate a given colour hue. Any such necessitation can be assimilated to a Kripken one. For the metaphysical necessitation of property Y by property X can be treated as the identity of X with the conjunction X and Y. So we could assimilate those to Kripken type necessities. Now what about truths about analytic ontology? This is something that Javier's interested in. Again, there are truths asserting the existence of categories, such as properties, relations, kinds, particular sets, numbers, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Lots of categories. These truths are necessary. The argument is how peculiar it would be to think of God playing a joke on analytic ontologists by making nominalism true some years, and other years making realism about universals being true, and other years deciding the universe is going to be made of tropes. That not merely would exhibit a strange sense of humour, well, perhaps not so strange sense of humour, it's clearly absurd. We may disagree, but one of the things we disagree about is that if these things, these categories exist, they exist necessarily. And Javier has called this the principle of the categorical homogeneity of the worlds. We can explain these, if we like, by treating categories as universals. Now, Jonathan Lowe, whom I much respect, rejects this, but I can't actually find where he's given an argument for rejecting it. Maybe it's just one of these metaphysical intuitions. One of the dangers of studying metaphysics is your intuitions seem to get more and more refined over the years. So things which you, before you studied philosophy, would have seemed totally ridiculous, and while you started studying it, you think, how would anyone decide this? You get to a certain age and you think, that's just obvious. I don't know why that is. I think it's occupational hazard. Anyway, some people reject this, at least Lowe rejects it, that we should treat categories as universals. I honestly don't know what the argument is. I'd be very interested in an argument. If there's an argument, it's important. We need to know it. But I don't see why we should. The fact that universals are a category doesn't mean that categories can't be universals, because self-instantiation is not a problem. Why is it a problem? Well, because of something I'll be assuming, that universals are respects in which things resemble. And if you assume that universals are respects in which things resemble, you have to follow David Armstrong in being a selective realist about universals. For example, not the typically negative so-called properties are not genuine universals. So, back to an example of Plato's, in Greek, a barbarian meant someone who doesn't speak Greek. In that sense, at least, barbarian is clearly a negative universal, and Plato, who recognized the variety of non-Greek languages, he recognized, for example, that Phrygian was somewhat similar to Greek, clearly rejected the idea there was a form of the non-Greek speaking. And this point can be made in all sorts of ways. There's no things don't resemble with respect to not being vermilion. So if you hold that universals are respects of resemblance, you will hold that you'll hold a selective or sparse theory that not every predicate corresponds to universal. David Lewis pointed out you need that anyway if you're to use universals to give an account of the naturalness of natural kinds and the greater and lesser degree of naturalness of various genuine properties. Some are more natural than others, and some, even if they do exist. So we think of green and blue as not being especially natural unless you're a so-called naive realist about colours, because of the scientifics. But they're still natural enough. They're not as natural as having precisely the wavelength of sodium yellow. And you need a sparse theory of universals. That's a digression. Given a sparse theory of universals, there's no problem in there being a universal of universalhood because you don't get the paradox. It doesn't mean there being a universal of not universalhood is paradoxical, probably, maybe not, but it'll lead to paradoxes somewhere along the line, but you don't have to worry. Okay, space-time, is that contingent or non-contingent? David Stove, who was one of my other teachers, quipped once of space and time, two more necessary things I never hoped to see. But is it necessary? For example, is it contingent whether space-time is discrete or continuous? Well, that's a debatable, but the point is this: if you think certain very basic properties of space-time are necessary, not necessary. Once upon a time, people thought that Euclidean geometry was necessary. Well, yes, maybe they did once upon a time, but it doesn't. The fact they were wrong doesn't mean there might not be some basic characteristics of space and time, or space-time, that are necessary. There's some general principles we often suppose are necessary. One of my favourites is that the volume of something cannot exceed the sum of the volume of parts that make it up. Okay? So you can't take a little bit of something and a little bit of something and add it all up, and then you've got much more. You can imagine some sort of magic by which you take a little bit of gold, another little bit of gold, another little bit of gold, and then lo and behold, you've got much more. That doesn't happen. In that sense, the whole is no greater than the sum of the parts. Well, you can assimilate that to the Kripken identity by defining supervolume, the least upper bounds of sums of volumes of disjoint parts, and then saying that volume is identical to supervolume. What about causal loops? Yeah, causal loops. The Big Bang causes the current epoch, which causes a final crunch, which then causes a Big Bang. Not another Big Bang, the very same Big Bang, the one we started off with. Is that possible? It's conceivable, at least if you think being able to describe something in mathematical terms without a contradiction is a mark of conceivability. It's conceivable. But is it possible? Lots of people have thought it's not possible. And finally, the most difficult case of necessity is supervenience. Well, actually, all cases of necessity are supervenience, but I mean the ones that aren't other cases. The necessity of supervenience is a bit tricky, actually. The example I give is you've got a black and white printer generating a pattern of dots. This is slightly different from Daniel Dennett's example of the pixels for reasons that are just slightly technical. And it gives you an image. Okay, so it gives you a smiley face image. Well, that doesn't depend on the dots alone. It also depends on what dots are not there. Obviously, if your machine malfunctions and goes on producing too many dots, you don't have a smiley face, you just have a black page. The various patterns of dots that could make up a smiley face don't share any straightforward geometric characterization. And there's a certain vagueness in what counts as a smiley face that doesn't correspond to vagueness in the dots. They're vague in a different way. Now, these features of supervenience are standardly explained using possible worlds. There are no two worlds that differ with respect to there being a smiley image on the piece of paper without a difference in the patterns of dots. So we seem to need possible worlds given the count of supervenience. So the idea is that the existence and relation between various universals grounds some necessities which ground possible worlds, which in turn ground supervenience. I would like to say the example of the dots and the smiley image is smiley face is also one of conceptual necessity. I don't think we can conceive of that pattern of dots not being the pattern we humans recognize as a smiley face, although of course it is conceivable that a smiley face might be interpreted as something quite different by a cat, say. But some other examples, such as the supervenience of values or non-evaluative facts, exhibit metaphysical but not conceptual necessity. Now, one last point. I think we're committed to fictional, impossible things. Why? Well, consider Quine's principle of ontological commitment. Now, Quine was a notorious non-fictionalist who didn't think there was any difference between there exists and there is. But if we assert something that implies there are x's, well, there are x's. Subject to defeat by paraphrase. Oh, I didn't really mean it. So if you talk about the average plumber, then if you say they're average plumbers, and the one I had yesterday was rather below average, then you're not actually committing yourself to average plumbers. But we do compare things that are conceivable but impossible. For example, if gold had turned out to be a copper-silver alloy, it would have been a better conductor of heat than if it had turned out to be an isotope of lead. Now, either that, or its negation maybe, can be supported by theoretical physics and chemistry. There's nothing mysterious about this counterfactual comparison. We know enough physics and chemistry, in principle, to be able to work out that if gold had turned out to be a copper-silver alloy, it would have been a better conductor than if it had turned out to be an isotope of lead. But that support is not a paraphrase. It's not what we mean. Again, we might speculate that because of its provenance, Richard Sylvan's full empty box that Graham Priest claims to have found among his belongings when he died will be more highly prized than the reddish-green T-shirt I use when supporting greenish-red candidates. Such examples are as persuasive as similar ones about possible non-actual situations, such as if Zeppo Marx had been elected President of the United States in 1940, he would have done a better job than if Groucho Marx had been elected. So I think whatever case we make for possible things, we have to make the same case for conceivable but impossible things, and these will just be fictions. Or at least they might be. I'm interested in an argument that for realism about impossible things, but since I'm going to treat non-actual things as fictions, they're going to be fictions too. So what have I said? I've argued, oh, sorry about that. I've argued that metaphysical necessity is distinct from conceivability, that necessity is to be understood in terms of the principle that all contingency concerns which universals have instances, and we should believe they're not just non-actual possibilities, but impossible conceivables.